Modern Chinese History by Professor Liu Zheng. Chapter 3. China at War, 1937–1948. The GMD government had been making considerable progress in rebuilding China and was also close to destroying its main internal challenger, the Communist movement, when the outbreak of hostilities with Japan reshuffled political priorities from inside and outside the government. Calls grew louder for a broad national coalition to resist Japan. However, it was only after Chiang Kai-shek had been abducted in Xi'an and held for 2 weeks in December 1936 that he agreed to stop the fight against the CCP. At least a unified and determined China entered the war to defend its territory. The result was a long, bitter war of resistance that required enormous sacrifices, devastated China, and changed its history. In 1937 and 1938, almost the entire eastern seaboard was lost to Japan, and the central government had to flee to Chongqing in 1937. Yet, much to the vexation of Japan, persistent Chinese resistance was able to forestall further Japanese progress. Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD controlled much of inland China under difficult circumstances, since Chongqing, the wartime capital, was remote and frequently attacked by air raids. The CCP built and expanded in the rural areas under its control in North China. The coastal areas from Manchuria to Guangxi were ruled by collaborationist governments that were steered by Japan. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, China's lone fight ended as it joined the Allies in a formal declaration of war against Japan, Germany, and Italy. With this, the War of Resistance became part of the global war theater of World War II. China was able to obtain support from the West, mostly the United States. Following the end of the global war, the two leading superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, despite their growing rivalry, agreed to strive for the establishment of a broad coalition government in China. During a few weeks of talks between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong in the summer of 1945, a post-war compromise in the form of a democratic, united China seemed a real possibility. However, growing hostility made this vision a fleeting moment of hope. A mistreated and exhausted China had to endure yet another war, which ended in 1949 with an improbable outcome. China, the most populous country on earth, became communist. Rising tensions in Xi'an. The conflict between China and Japan had been long in the making. Japan had not always been a rival. Japan became a competitor, however, as it remodeled itself as an expanding empire with continental ambitions. With limited resources and territory on the Japanese islands, Japan sought to secure access to resources such as foodstuffs, metals, and minerals in northern China, a region that was increasingly portrayed as its lifeline in Japanese eyes. Chiang Kai-shek and his government resembled a predatory warlord regime that lacked real legitimacy to represent China. Japan saw itself as the true heir of East Asian empires, including the Qing. It promoted the ideology of Pan-Asianism, arguing that the nations of the East should unite under Japan's leadership to resist Western materialism and imperialism. In 1928, when the Chinese warlord Zhang Zuolin in Manchuria threatened to impede Japanese encroachment, Japan had him assassinated. The murder of Zhang Zuolin unmistakably indicated Japan's determination to gain control over Manchuria by pushing fully for Japanese expansion on the Chinese mainland. The leaders of the Guangdong Army, as the Japanese army in China was called, were strongly driven by such thinking. For instance, Colonel Ishihara Kanji, the Guangdong Army's operations officer from 1929 to 1932, believed that a great war between Japan and the United States was inevitable. In that scenario, the possession of Manchuria was an essential precondition for Japanese survival. On September 18, 1931, Ishihara's forces blew up a section of the southern Manchurian railway tracks at a major crossroads in Mukden, now named Shenyang, and blamed Chinese military forces for the action. With this step, the nationalistic officers of the Guangdong Army achieved in 1931 what their assassination of Zhang Zuolin had failed to gain in 1928. By December, the Japanese forces controlled most of Manchuria. Soon, the independent state of Manchukuo was established, and the Japanese authorities managed to convince the last Qing emperor, Puyi, to become the official ruler of China. A passionate public debate ensued over how to deal with Japan. The 9/18 Incident, as the Mukden Incident is called in Chinese, became a major turning point. The loss of Manchuria mobilized the Chinese public more than any prior instance of territorial loss. Activists, such as Chinese refugees from Manchuria through a lobbying group called the Northeast National Salvation Society and patriotic students, demanded that the government put up determined resistance. Chiang Kai-shek, however, steadfastly refused. He believed China lacked the military capabilities to challenge the Japanese army. While he pledged to resist Japanese aggression and saw it as the biggest threat facing China, after the occupation of Manchuria, Japan eyed Shanghai as the next step in its invasion. On January 18, 1932, a Japanese agent allegedly organized the beating of 5 Japanese men and blamed it on a Chinese laborer. As retaliation, Japanese expatriates in Shanghai began rioting in the city, injuring more people. This, in turn, prompted Chinese protests against the Japanese violence. By January 27, the Japanese military delivered an ultimatum to the Shanghai municipal government, demanding a public denunciation and payments for damages to Japanese property, as well as the suppression of all anti-Japanese protests in the city. In response, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the Chinese 19th Route Army to move in and put up a vigorous defense of Shanghai. For several months, Japan and China engaged in the battle that came to be known as the Shanghai War of 1932. The Chinese army kept the Japanese from taking the city. The Japanese even increased their troop numbers to nearly 90,000, supported by 80 warships and 300 airplanes. The Japanese Navy bombed and assaulted Chinese-controlled portions of Shanghai, completely destroying Jia district north of the international settlement that was populated mostly by Chinese, sending 230,000 refugees fleeing to that settlement or elsewhere. On March 2, the 19th Route Army pulled out of Shanghai through the mediation of the League of Nations. On May 5, China and Japan signed the Shanghai Ceasefire Agreement, which made Shanghai a demilitarized zone. In 1933, the Japanese army took over the province of Ri, which had been controlled by Zhang Chong. Given the unrelenting expansion of Japanese troops, Chiang Kai-shek sought to sign an agreement with Japan. His hope was to gain more time and breathing space for his government to prepare for the ultimate conflict that Chiang and most Chinese were certain was on the horizon. On May 31, 1933, the country signed the Tung Troop Agreement, and a demilitarized zone south of Ri Province was created, which became the border between Manchuria and China. It effectively avoided full-scale fighting between Japan and China until November 1937. In November 1935, Japan established a Chinese government, a self-governing regime in Hebei, with the local Chinese official Yin Ren as governor. It was called the East Hebei Anti-Communist Autonomous Council and had a population of 6 million people under the control of Japanese military advisors. A pattern was thus set for later collaborationist regimes in China proper. As Japan relentlessly increased its pressure, the Chinese public, as well as several GMD generals, demanded that the nationalist government redouble its efforts to fend off the Japanese army. The continuous advance of Japan alarmed Stalin and the Soviet Union. Moscow informed the Chinese Communists of its pessimistic assessment of the current situation in East Asia. In July 1935, the Seventh World Congress of the Kuomintang called for the creation of worldwide popular fronts against fascism. Hence, the CCP was instructed to find ways to end the fight against the nationalist government and to direct its struggle against Japanese imperialism instead. On August 1, 1935, the CCP issued a statement underscoring those instructions. This statement, referred to as the August 1 Declaration, marked a turn in the CCP policy from anti-Chiang and anti-Japan toward a renewed cooperation between the two hostile parties to resist Japan. Zhou Enlai and Jiang Jieshi between April and June or July 1936 were to negotiate and end military actions against the Communists. A renewed cooperation between the two parties against Japan led to the formation of a united army. By early December, the two sides had reached a tentative agreement. However, when Jiang later tried to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to halt his campaign against the CCP, Chiang refused. Chiang Kai-shek's real intent was to mobilize reinforcements for what might prove a decisive final assault on the CCP. The local troops under Jiang were, however, resisting marching orders and delaying the bandit suppression campaign against the CCP. Chiang Kai-shek flew to Xi'an on December 4. He wanted to prompt the troops at Jiang's headquarters in Xi'an to begin the big final attack. Instead, Jiang decided to take Chiang prisoner. This detention, which lasted for almost 2 weeks, became known as the Xi'an Incident of 1936. Jiang felt that circumstances of national emergency forced his hand and legitimized just such a mutiny. In the early morning of December 12, Jiang made his move, arrested Chiang Kai-shek, and by telegram informed the CCP of his action. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai were taken completely by surprise yet rejoiced to hear the news. Mao wanted to try Chiang for treason in a people's court of law. Stalin argued that a trial and execution of Chiang Kai-shek would deepen internal strife in Chinese society, weaken its defensive capabilities, and therefore only benefit Japan's aggressive policies. Stalin was convinced that only Chiang Kai-shek had the ability to lead China into war against Japan, therefore, he instructed them to seek a peaceful solution on behalf of the CCP. Zhou Enlai was dispatched to Xi'an to take part in the negotiations. Chiang's wife, Song Meiling, and her brother, Prime Minister T.V. Soong, also came to Xi'an. Meanwhile, Jiang started negotiating. He demanded that Chiang Kai-shek stop the campaign against the communist forces and instead lead a united front against Japan, but Chiang then refused to sign a written statement to that effect. After lengthy talks, it was agreed that his wife and brother-in-law, the Soong siblings, would sign on his behalf. The situation became tense as talks came to a stalemate. Meanwhile, the Nanjing government mobilized the army and set troops in motion toward Xi'an. Jiang feared that a new civil war could break out should Chiang be killed or detained much longer. He needed to act quickly to release Chiang and then fly back with him to Nanjing without informing the CCP or his own troops. Jiang put Chiang Kai-shek and Song Meiling on a plane to Nanjing. Chiang returned on December 26 after 14 days of captivity. 8 months of negotiations ensued before the CCP and the GMD arrived at a plan for the Second United Front. This second effort at unity ensured the independence of both the GMD and the CCP. The GMD agreed to release all political prisoners and to stop its military campaigns against the communist areas. The CCP promised to terminate its pursuit of armed uprisings and radical land policies. The Second United Front planned for the eventuality of war against Japan. But both the CCP and the GMD assumed that essential support would come from the Soviet Union. Jiang Jieshi, however, was immediately arrested by Chen Guofu. He would spend the next 50 years under house arrest as a result of the Xi'an Incident. China was able to fully mobilize all of its military forces to repel Japan's further advance in the following years. Japan's attempts to overcome persistent Chinese resistance consumed considerable resources. Ultimately, it was unable to defeat China on the battlefield and occupy the entire country. Moreover, had Japan not been bogged down in China, it would surely have deployed more troops and material to its other military campaigns against the United States in the Pacific Theater and against the Soviet Union in the Northeast. Without the Xi'an Incident, World War II would likely have taken a very different course, both in Europe and in the Pacific. The event also marked the beginning of Russia's rising military power and political clout in China. After 1936, Chiang Kai-shek became the undisputed national leader accepted by all camps in the fight against Japan. The CCP, however, benefited more in the long run from their official recognition as a national force. No longer rebels or bandits, they were regarded as a legitimate part of a nationalist coalition. The entire political field was reconfigured, and structures emerged that would profoundly influence post-war development in China. The battle began. The establishment of the United Front and the support of the Soviet Union convinced Japanese leaders that a full-scale war was inevitable. On July 7, 1937, a minor dispute between Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing finally led to open hostility between the two countries. The Japanese government tried for several weeks to settle the incident locally, but in China, public opinion demanded decisive resistance to further aggression. When fighting broke out in late July, the battle for North China began. The Japanese quickly took Beijing and proceeded to capture Shanghai on August 13, 1937. Japanese and Chinese troops clashed further in the south, this time for China's most important city, Shanghai. 3 months of bitterly fought and extremely destructive combat followed, in which Chiang Kai-shek deployed more than 500,000 men for the defense of Shanghai. Seeking an early standoff to gain the upper hand and engage the enemy in a decisive battle, he led his best-equipped, German-trained troops into the urban battlefield. According to Chinese data, around 190,000 Chinese soldiers were killed or maimed in just those 3 months. Though the Chinese military fought bravely, it lost large portions of its best troops and most valuable equipment in the battle for Shanghai. The devastating battle for Shanghai revealed that the nationalist resolve to defend China was very real. The determination of the Chinese also surprised Japan. Extracted a heavy toll. During the first year of the war, Japan won victory after victory despite Chinese resistance. In October 1937, the Chinese government started to move its administration first to Chongqing in Sichuan. By late December, Shanghai and Nanjing had fallen, the latter city providing the site of the infamous Nanjing massacre perpetrated by Japanese troops. From December 1937 to January 1938, for 6 weeks, Japanese troops went on a spree of murder, rape, looting, and torture, seemingly throwing aside all restraint. The Japanese allowed Nanjing to descend into complete chaos. Meanwhile, in North China, the Japanese met increasing resistance and suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Taiyuan, enduring nearly 2 months of combat before eventually taking the city in November 1937. From there, Japanese troops moved quickly down the east coast of China, making use of China's rail system. In April 1938, Chiang Kai-shek's troops managed to score a rare victory in Jiangsu province, boosting the morale of the troops and the public in the hard-fought Battle of Taihang. They beat back the enemy, temporarily halting the Japanese onslaught. But soon thereafter, a critical railway junction was lost, which allowed the Japanese army to continue its advance westward and southward from June through October 1938. Japanese troops advanced toward Chongqing, fighting numerous battles north and south of the Yangtze River in a reckless effort to halt the progress of the Japanese army. Chiang Kai-shek gave orders to open the dikes of the Yellow River, which slowed the Japanese advance by only a few weeks. Similarly, retreating Chinese troops chose to burn Changsha rather than leave anything of value behind for the Japanese. Changsha would later be successfully defended 3 times before the Japanese finally occupied the city in 1944. While this scorched-earth strategy slowed the Japanese troops down, it ultimately could not stop them. Meanwhile, Japan continued its advance with a vengeance. Japanese Navy planes raided Guangzhou for 14 months before the Japanese army took the city on October 21, disrupting the railway supply line to Wuhan, where the temporary Chinese military command was located. It also captured the triple city of Hanyang, Hankou, and Wuhan over the course of October 25 to 26. Soon, the Japanese gained control over all the major railway lines and cities of China. Incessant fighting and bombing during the first year of the war wreaked havoc on countless Chinese cities, crushed infrastructure, took millions of lives, and set even more millions of refugees in motion. The displacements destabilized Chinese society and unraveled the fabric of social and political order. the end of the war in 1945. Apart from Sichuan, the nationalist government could also claim to control Yunnan, Hunan, southern Sichuan, western Hubei, and southern Shaanxi, and pockets of Guizhou and Guangxi. Large parts of those regions, especially Sichuan and Shaanxi, had been in the hands of various warlords. Since 1911, the area had suffered from the protracted wars among them, militarists, as well as associations like the Green Gang and Red Gang, which continued to wield great power in this unruly area. Chongqing was an important commercial hub for the economy of southwest China, but the landlocked region was isolated from the coast and relatively backward. Its industrial development lagged behind that of the coastal areas. Sichuan had few the railways and highways and only a small base of modern industries, such as the steel production. However, it offered natural protection in the form of mountains and hills that would turn any Japanese assault by land into an arduous undertaking. The region also had rich natural resources and highly productive agriculture. With the relocation of the nationalist government to Chongqing, the development of the city and the area accelerated markedly. The government committed funding for investment in infrastructure and housing. The Dianing Road connecting Yunnan and Burma was extended and improved, quickly becoming a lifeline connecting nationalist China to the world. Chongqing also became an aviation center after 1941, where U.S. supplies would arrive here via airlift. Chongqing became a center for the steel, machinery, and weapons industries. Meanwhile, as the communist area was exhausted, decimated, and constantly harassed by the nationalist troops on its long march, the CCP sought refuge in North Shaanxi, in the walled town of Yan'an in autumn 1935. Later, in December 1935, it relocated to another location, name uncertain from context. During those years, the leaders hid in caves dug into the soft loess soil of Shaanxi. Pictures of these caves taken by American journalist Edgar Snow were seen around the world. Although territory held by the Communists had shrunk in 1936 due to Kuomintang extermination campaigns, the Xi'an Incident, and then the outbreak of war with Japan provided much-needed relief and renewed belief. In January 1937, the leadership was able to move into the largest city in the region, Yan'an. Initially, there were two base areas developed by the CCP in the desolate borderlands of Shaanxi, Gansu, and Ningxia provinces. On September 6, 1937, the formal announcement came that these had been merged to establish the Shaanxi-Gansu border region, with Yan'an as the capital. This border region, with its population of about 1.5 million, was poor, entirely agricultural, and prone to disasters. Here during the war against the Japanese. Yan'an was a secure and relatively stable border region where the party leadership, including Mao Zedong, resided. Aside from it, there were also three other larger border regions, all located in North China. Very soon after the outbreak of war, the 8th Route Army crossed the Yellow River into Shaanxi province and started to build a border area there. The establishment of the Shaanxi-Gansu border region was formally announced in January 1938. And it soon became the most important and successful of the border areas. Finally, there was the Jinchaji border region. Its origins began in October 1937 as the Taihang guerrilla zone on the Hebei-Shaanxi border. In the fight against Japan, the CCP infiltrated rural areas behind enemy lines in northern and central China to establish base areas or guerrilla zones. Operating within the general framework of the United Front against Japan, the leaders of the 8th Route Army adopted a strategy based on their experience in guerrilla warfare. They sent small columns into areas of northern China that the Japanese army had overrun but lacked the manpower to control. Continuous attacks by Japanese forces and the collaborationist governments indeed decimated the communist-led forces and the areas the CCP ruled in the years leading up to 1942. The communist areas were reduced by almost half. Neither the campaign nor guerrilla warfare tactics could repulse or seriously threaten Japan. The most they could do was to continue tying down and wearing out the substantial Japanese forces in Yan'an. The party also continued to receive considerable aid from the Soviet Union. Moscow sent money, fuel, military supplies, and other strategic goods. Communist military power expanded dramatically. In 1937, the Red Army had 70,000 poorly trained and primitively armed soldiers. By the time of the Japanese surrender, those forces had grown substantially into an army of 1 million regular soldiers, uniformly well-trained and well-equipped. Beyond these, there were also several million peasants organized in local militias. The Yan'an period turned out to be very significant for the CCP. The contrast of the situation between the early 1930s and the early 1940s could not be greater. In the beginning of the 1930s, the party had teetered on the brink of destruction, was mired in internal strife, and had little backing in rural society. It was forced to evacuate the Soviet region in Jiangxi and to flee pursuing GMD troops by marching thousands of kilometers across China. By the 1940s, the CCP controlled a large part of northern China and had built solid local governments. There is no denying that the CCP used the period in Yan'an well. It was little more than a ragtag army and political nuisance. A decade later, it was on its way to becoming a serious competitor for national power. For the occupied territories, Manchuria became home to the most important of those puppet regimes. Since the end of the Qing Empire, Manchuria had been transformed. Quickly increased migration from northern China led to population growth and settlement of the vast plains. Around 1930, the population was estimated to be 30 million, of which 28 million were ethnically Chinese or Manchu, the remainder were Mongols, Koreans, and Japanese. The construction of the railroad lines connecting the southern port of Inko with regions in the north, such as Harbin, and the opening of several ports in the first decade of the 20th century, including Dalian, stimulated rapid economic development, centered mainly on the export of agricultural products. A British diplomat, the Earl of Lytton, was charged to lead an inquiry into the status of Manchuria. Based on a visit to Manchuria by the Lytton Commission in April 1932, a report was issued in October of the same year. While the report refused to recognize Manchukuo as a legitimate state and suggested measures to return it to China, it did highlight that the integration of Manchuria into the Republic of China had been more nominal than real. Japan did not, however, accept the recommendations of the report. In 1935, it withdrew in protest from the League of Nations in defiance of the League's stance. The founding of the independent Republic of Manchukuo was declared in March 1932. Its government was headed by the last Qing Emperor, Henry Puyi, as head of state, and had its seat in the new capital, Changchun. Manchukuo was envisioned as a multicultural polity to be made up of various ethnic groups, such as Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Manchus, and Mongols, all living together peacefully. In reality, however, there was no real independence, as the Japanese army exercised supervision and tight control over all branches of the government and over Manchukuo's decisions. In 1934, Manchukuo was reconceived as an empire, and Puyi became an emperor again, this time of the Manchukuo Empire. For reformist Japanese officials, Manchukuo became a convenient testing ground for new techniques of political administration, industrial management, and planning. In 1936, the government announced the first 5-year plan for the development of industry. State companies, in which the government was a principal or important shareholder, were set up in selected sectors of the economy, such as mining. The government intended to promote heavy industrialization and make Manchuria a showcase of Japanese industrial might. The new empire's economic development was indeed stunning. Manchuria had developed into a large, relatively industrialized country with vast coal and iron resources, a vibrant market for consumer goods, and significant Japanese investments in education, infrastructure, and public health. Moreover, motivations to work with Japan were diverse. The co-optation of landholding elites was a top priority for the Manchukuo government. Those elites had never supported the revolutionary rhetoric of the nationalist government. They were, above all, interested in maintaining stability and safeguarding the existing order, which Japan seemed to promise. There were also ardent Manchukuo supporters of Manchurian regional autonomy and self-governance who hoped to pursue their dreams of independence from China with the help of Japan. Although cooperation with the Japanese became the norm, there were also notable acts of resistance. These were met with intensely brutal methods by the Japanese army. One of the most notorious incidents was the massacre on September 16, 1932, at Pingxia, near the industrial city of Fushun in Fengtian. Because that village had resisted Japanese troops, it was entirely razed as an act of reprisal, and nearly 3,000 civilians were killed. Chinese residents of Manchukuo who were accused of transgressions were also forced into labor service in concentration camps. Experiments were carried out on prisoners between 1937 and 1945 by a division called Special Unit 731. Shiro Ishii, a physician and army officer, was in charge of this unit. Here, too, human guinea pigs were used to test diseases ranging from anthrax to yellow fever. Besides testing pathogens on humans, other secret research focused on the cultivation and dissemination of biological warfare agents. Thousands were killed. The Guangdong Army played a central role in developing and governing Manchukuo. A new set of institutions was created under its direction, with the goal of building a model society. Those institutions can best be described as a combination of military fascist elements and Confucian norms of hierarchy, obedience, and respect. Manchuria played an important role in the making of Japan's colonial ideology. The Japanese government tried to use migrants to consolidate its hold on Manchuria, sending large groups of settlers to the region under Japanese leadership. Manchukuo and China would be led into a holy war for the liberation of East Asia from Western control and then guided by Japan to succeed with modernization and development. This vision grew by the mid-1930s into the East Asian League and the East Asian Community, and still later into the idea of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In December 1937, the Provisional Government of the Republic of China was established with the help of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. Was absorbed into the new government. Thus, the Provisional Government nominally controlled a large swath of territory in northern China, including the provinces of Hebei, Shandong, Shaanxi, Chahar, and Suiyuan. The Provisional Government was a republic with legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. It issued its own currency and also formed its own army, called the North China Autonomous Army. It chose as its national flag the same five-colored flag that had been used by the Beiyang government in 1912. In general, many of the Chinese officials who worked with Japan had served in the Bonn government. They had always resented the nationalist government and saw a window of opportunity to resurrect, with the help of the Japanese Empire, the Xi'an government, which in their eyes had always been the true successor to the Qing dynasty. The renewed government also used the Bonn flag and controlled the provinces of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Anhui, as well as the two municipalities of Nanjing and Shanghai. It was headed by Liang Hongzhi, who had worked for the warlord Duan Qirui and earlier also served in the Bonn government. Its structure was a constitutional republic, and its capital was Nanjing, although it had its offices in Shanghai. A 10-point political program also promised 3 branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, and a multi-party system as its goals. The government emphasized anti-communism, economic reconstruction, and the replacement of modern shallow doctrines with China's traditional moral culture. The renewed government existed from March 1938 to March 1940, when all the provisional governments were subordinated, at least nominally, to a new national government in Nanjing headed by Wang Jingwei. For the Japanese, the decision to found occupation regimes was intended to build more stable relations with the Chinese population. Functioning state institutions would sustain Japan's war effort by facilitating the restoration of order and productivity in occupied China. Throughout the war years, the Japanese government repeatedly approached the GMD government and proposed to find a diplomatic settlement. Japan made, on average, 4 diplomatic overtures per year, and in 1 year, 1938, that number rose to 11. Chiang Kai-shek steadfastly rejected Japan's offers because he would not accede to any loss of sovereignty and territory. They were also highly critical of the United Front with the Communist Party and the government's dependence on the Soviet Union. Wang Jingwei, in particular, sought to resolutely distance himself from leftists, socialists, and labor activists. Finally, when an attempt was made on his life, Wang Jingwei shifted toward the peace movement and the decision to collaborate with Japan. Of the Republic of China was established in Nanjing under Japanese sponsorship, and he was appointed to chair it. Established with the slogan of national reconstruction with peace and anti-communism, Wang's collaborationist government controlled most of the occupied areas from March 1940 to August 1945. He set up a reorganized, formally autonomous nationalist government. Japanese authorities, however, observed Wang's government closely, and the Japanese army had the final say in all decisions. Nevertheless, his emphasis on the state's wartime role as the protector of the people, on rebuilding the national economy, and on developing a close Sino-Japanese relationship suggests that he was motivated by more than just the quest for power to create his vision of a new world order. He merged his versions of nationalism, Pan-Asianism, and the 3 principles of the people into a new Wang Jingwei doctrine. He also launched a campaign called the New Citizen Movement, which incorporated civic elements of Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles. In the areas ruled by Wang Jingwei, local Chinese self-administration continued. Local communities also policed themselves and enjoyed the benefits of a temporary respite from the horrors of war. They tried to keep their factories operating under Japanese rule. In these areas, a modest economic recovery was underway. Trade between the occupied areas and the rest of China, both legal and illicit, was also flourishing. By this point in the war, a global war since the spring of 1937, China had fought a bitter and desperate struggle against Japan. China had already been living with the horrific losses and far-reaching consequences of more than 2 years of brutal warfare on its territory. The outbreak of the Second World War had effects on the war theater in China. Both parties and political camps in China knew that profound change was coming for China and especially the GMD. This meant not only that Soviet support for its war effort would dry up but that Japan would be able to free up forces along the Russian border and redeploy them in China. In late 1939, Japan indeed renewed its efforts and started several new initiatives to expand its occupied territories and defeat Chiang Kai-shek's government. Even worse, in July 1940, the British government temporarily conceded to Japan's demand that it close the Burma Road, linking the British colony with China. The British decision essentially cut off the delivery of much-needed war equipment and material via the Burma Road into China. In late September 1940, Japan, Italy, and Germany joined in a military alliance, the Axis, and all German military advisors were withdrawn from China. The country was left completely to its own devices in its fight against Japan. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek was looking for new allies. By the end of 1940, when the United States started to respond to Chinese requests for aid, the U.S. government announced a loan to Chongqing as well as the delivery of 50 military aircraft. The end of 1941 brought an important and sudden turning point. Japan's unexpected and devastating attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7 led to America's entry into the war and consequently also ended China's relative international isolation. The war went truly global. Within weeks, the China-Burma-India theater of war was established with Chiang Kai-shek as supreme commander. From that moment on, China fought alongside the Allies in an all-out war against the Axis powers. American assistance began to flow. The United States sent supplies, military equipment, and advisors via a costly, difficult, and dangerous airlift over the Himalayan mountains called the Hump. The Flying Tigers, a volunteer corps of U.S. flyers, also began to attack Japanese forces. The Americans equipped Chiang's best troops and trained his administrators. They also sent specialists to coach his intelligence services. The Sino-American Cooperation Organization was set up not far from the prison camp under a secret agreement signed in 1942. From 1943 to 1945, American police officers and intelligence personnel were stationed there. They trained Chinese secret agents and spies. In February 1942, the United States also sent a chief advisor, the highly decorated and respected General Joseph Stilwell, to Chongqing. As one of the few U.S. officers fluent in Chinese, Stilwell often found himself in direct conflict with Chiang Kai-shek. Stilwell's job was to convince Chiang Kai-shek to deploy his troops for bold attacks on Japanese positions, while Chiang Kai-shek hoped for large campaigns by the British and the Americans in Burma to relieve Chinese forces fighting in China. Chiang complained that Stilwell and the United States were not doing enough and demanded more U.S. operations. Stilwell accused his Chinese counterparts of unwillingness to send Chinese ground troops into battle. China gained international recognition and stature in January 1943. New treaties were signed between China, Great Britain, and the United States to revoke the last surviving remnants of Western imperialism, reverse the system of legal extraterritoriality, and return all concessions, including the international settlement and French concession in Shanghai, to Chinese rule after the war. The treaties also cancelled all Chinese debt assigned by the 1901 Boxer Protocol. In November 1943, Chiang Kai-shek attended the Cairo Conference, the only one of the international war conferences where China was formally represented. Support, but beyond that, he would also demand the recovery of all lost territories, not only the territories occupied by Japan but also territories in Tibet, Outer Mongolia, Xinjiang, Manchuria, and even Hong Kong and the treaty ports. As still another objective, he aimed to establish China as an equal power among the Allies. In private conversations with Roosevelt leading up to the meeting, Chiang expressed the hope that the policy toward British imperialism could also be successful. By this point in the war, the movement to liberate those in the world who are oppressed was also flourishing. This ran up against strong British objections. Prime Minister Winston Churchill stressed that while Great Britain would not seek territorial gains, it intended to hold on to what it had, including Hong Kong. Stalin made clear that he would fully respect China's claims in Manchuria and accept the pre-war Manchurian border line. In the end, the Allies also published a joint declaration requiring Japan to return all occupied areas in Manchuria, Taiwan, and the pescadores to China. This was a considerable success for Chiang Kai-shek. The Cairo Conference certainly displayed to the world how far China had politically recovered from the devastating setbacks of the 19th century. China was being treated, for the first time in modern history, as a great power. It also claimed, for the first time, the role of advocate for the colonial world on the international stage. Actually, helping China defeat Japan was clearly not a priority for the West. Chiang Kai-shek stressed China's support for the establishment of an international organization, later called the United Nations, to maintain peace in the post-war period. As agreed in Cairo, a North Burma campaign was carried out in 1944. The Anglo-American forces set out to retake Burma, which had been occupied by Japan in 1942, with the assistance of some of Chiang Kai-shek's best remaining forces. Chinese resistance gradually increased with mounting support from the American Air Force. It was during this same time that Japan started the largest campaign ever conducted by the Imperial Japanese Army. The campaign ran from April 17, 1944, to early February 1945. It attempted to secure a passage through the Chinese heartland to create a continuous land route extending from Korea to Indochina. It also aimed to eliminate airfields in Sichuan and Guangxi that were used by the United States to conduct air raids over Japanese cities. 500,000 Japanese soldiers were mobilized, and they fought against 1 million Chinese soldiers from April to December 1944. China suffered a string of grave defeats as well as the loss of many valuable troops. Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, a similar bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Japan capitulated. In the final years of the war, neither the CCP nor the GMD had doubted that a civil war would erupt in China after the defeat of the Japanese. Yet, when the U.S. attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced the sudden Japanese surrender in August 1945, both the Communists and the nationalist government seemed unprepared to act. The Soviet Union concluded a treaty of friendship and alliance with the nationalist government on August 14, 1945. With that treaty, Chiang Kai-shek conceded to virtually all of Stalin's demands regarding Mongolia and the Sino-Soviet border in Manchuria. The secession of Outer Mongolia was China's most substantial territorial loss in the entire 20th century. In those areas where the Soviet Red Army had disarmed the Japanese, Chinese Communist forces obtained large amounts of arms and ammunition. It was only a matter of time before the nationalist government and communist troops would clash, as both sides attempted to extend the areas under their control. Neither Moscow nor Washington had a clear plan for coping with the situation in China. American officials were sharply divided in their evaluation of the situation in China. Some American leaders were convinced that the Chinese Communists were obedient to Moscow, so that their victory would tip the balance in Asia in Stalin's favor. Rather than allow the Soviets to seize control of China, they argued, the United States should continue providing support to Chiang. Others pointed out that China would not necessarily be hostile to the United States. They urged the administration, if civil war could not be avoided, to keep the United States out of it. The Soviet Union, while in principle pledging support to the CCP, was equally conflicted. Stalin was not willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of Mao. Stalin's uncertainty was reflected in Soviet actions in the months following Japan's surrender. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it is clear that Soviet policy cannot be understood as a straightforward commitment to the CCP's cause in the summer of 1945. Soviet and U.S. policy both aimed at the creation of a coalition government once Japan capitulated. The eccentric American ambassador in China, Patrick J. Early, believed he could broker a lasting coalition government. The first post-war American effort led to direct talks between Chiang and Mao. Shortly afterward, Mao Zedong traveled to Chongqing, where he landed on August 27, 1945, and had dinner with Chiang Kai-shek the same evening. Over a period of 6 weeks, the two men held many private meetings. The two leaders issued a hopeful joint declaration on October 10, 1945. The GMD government returned to Nanjing in 1946. In the same year, the United States made another attempt to find a peaceful solution. President Truman reaffirmed America's commitment to a strong, united, and democratic China and dispatched General Marshall to the country. Marshall's mission, which he pursued for virtually all of 1946, was to persuade Chiang and Mao that they should cease hostilities and form a coalition government. Fighting resumed in October 1946. Mao became convinced that the United States was committed to the GMD, and an anti-American propaganda campaign was launched that accused the United States of trying to dominate China and portrayed Chiang Kai-shek as the running dog of American imperialism. A full-scale civil war raged in China from mid-1947 through mid-1949. The Americans and Soviets kept a close eye on each other, but neither side intervened militarily. Chiang's forces advanced on all fronts until they captured Yan'an itself in March 1947. However, the rapid occupation of North China and Manchuria, coupled with Chiang Kai-shek's impatient insistence on ending the conflict with the CCP with a quick military offensive, was a costly mistake. Combined with the tactical mistakes made in the decisive Huaihai battles in late 1948, these strategic errors lost the war for the GMD. When the Communists counterattacked at the end of 1947, nationalist units were left isolated in the cities. The Communists took Jinzhou and Beijing in January 1949 and opened a southward offensive in April. Nanjing was taken on April 23, and Shanghai on May 27. By June, the Communist Army had grown to 1.5 million men, while Chiang's forces had shrunk to 2.1 million. The Kuomintang government fled to Canton, then to Chongqing, then to Chengdu, and finally, in early December 1949, to Taiwan. For almost 3 decades of continuous and brutal warfare, total casualties of the Chinese population may have been as high as 40 million. Equally devastating was the destruction of infrastructure, industries, and buildings, and the debilitating effects on the Chinese body politic. These wars, however, also showed how far China had come by mid-century. Decades of military buildup, military recruitment and training, and the spread of martial values and attitudes had made China significantly stronger in military terms and more capable of defending itself. In 1900, the country's debilitated military lost nearly every battle, but 50 years later, it had managed to tie down one of the most formidable and efficient military machines in the world in a grinding, protracted war of resistance. In 1949, China was a scarred but battle-hardened country. In 1911, China had been at the forefront of a century of global change, renewal, and revolution. While European empires destroyed each other during the First World War, China witnessed the first golden age of Chinese capitalism and made Shanghai the cosmopolitan center of Asia and the world. China also set out to create a dynamic system of higher education, one that would train the scientists and technocrats of later generations. It strengthened its army, rebuilt institutions, mobilized and disciplined its citizens, and successfully defended the country.
在本节目结束之前，如果您感到满意，请订阅本频道。您的订阅就是对我每天努力制作节目的最大支持。让我们一起传播真相，了解世界和中国真实的历史文化和现实政治的进程。谢谢大家观看。